On a small copper alloy medal, Admiral Edward Vernon stood triumphant while Blas de Lezo surrendered before him on both knees. Around them, an engraved legend announced that British heroes had taken Cartagena, a city still firmly held by Spain. The medal offered no uncertainty. Its reverse dated the conquest to April 1741, before declaring the Spanish port taken. One surviving example now sits in the collection at Greenwich, its copper alloy preserving a victory that never occurred. Even its reverse completes the fantasy. Ships approach forts, a chain guards the channel, and Cartagena waits beyond them. Such confidence did not come from nowhere. Vernon had recently delivered Britain the kind of clean success public memory loves. In late 1739, he attacked Portobello, a Spanish Caribbean port, with only 6 ships of the line. Portobello fell quickly, and news crossed the Atlantic faster than any sober assessment of what that success actually proved. Britain saw a bold admiral humiliating Spain. Merchants saw weakened restrictions, politicians saw momentum, and crowds saw a hero. Vernon also tested Cartagena with a smaller bombardment in 1740, revealing its defenses without securing the city Britain increasingly coveted. Success concealed its own warning. A limited objective surprised by concentrated naval force did not provide a universal method. Cartagena was a different problem. Rich, strategically important, and protected by geography, layered fortifications, ships, soldiers, and difficult approaches. Its harbor opened through narrow entrances that defenders could fortify, obstruct, and contest before an attacker reached the city itself. Taking the port required more than cannon fire. British troops would need landing grounds, roads, supplies, coordination, and time. Time was especially dangerous in the Caribbean, where sickness could reduce an army before Spanish fire decided anything at all. None of that made Cartagena untouchable. It made the operation dependent upon several difficult tasks succeeding in the right sequence. Britain nevertheless approached the campaign with expectations shaped by Portobello, public pressure, and confidence in superior maritime power alone. The war itself had grown from disputes over trade, smuggling, and Spanish enforcement across Britain's Atlantic commercial world system. The severed ear of merchant captain Robert Jenkins became its most memorable symbol, though the conflict had broader causes. Once fighting began, colonial commerce, naval reputation, and parliamentary politics all encouraged an attack capable of producing visible results. Cartagena promised exactly that. Its capture could damage Spanish communications, shelter British operations, and advertise power throughout the Caribbean. The objective therefore attracted an expedition far larger than Vernon's Portobello squadron. Warships, transports, soldiers, marines, and supplies accumulated. Scale looked reassuring on paper. At sea, every additional hull demanded water, food, crews, coordination, and protected anchorage. An immense fleet could batter defenses, yet it also carried an immense population vulnerable to delay, heat, contamination, and disease. Command was divided. Vernon controlled the naval force, while General Thomas Wentworth commanded the soldiers expected to seize ground. Their responsibilities overlapped wherever troops needed ships, boats, bombardment, or supplies, which meant cooperation was not optional administrative courtesy. Vernon brought experience, confidence, and a public reputation already secured. Wentworth brought less campaign experience to a complicated amphibious command. Neither commander possessed perfect information about Cartagena, and neither could control the season, disease, or every subordinate involved ashore. The expedition also included troops raised in Britain's North American colonies, adding manpower but also training and supply problems. Men from different services and colonies entered the same operation with unequal equipment, expectations, status, and experience of Caribbean warfare. Before any wall could be breached, these parts had to become one functioning expedition under distant, uncertain communications at sea. Spain did not need to defeat British naval power everywhere. It needed Cartagena to remain unconquered through the campaign. That defensive objective allowed fortifications, channels, local knowledge, and delaying actions to work together steadily against the attacker's timetable. Lezo was central to that effort, but he was not Cartagena's sole defender or the only senior commander present. Viceroy Sebastián de Eslava held overall authority, while Lezo directed crucial naval defenses. Their relationship carried its own tensions. Cartagena's defense rested upon Spanish regulars, sailors, militia, fortified positions, and the ability to exchange space for time. Ships could become barriers, outer works could delay in advance, and every delay increased the expedition's exposure ashore to sickness. Across the Atlantic, such defensive logic was nearly invisible. The imagined ending remained Vernon's triumph, not a prolonged campaign. Metalworkers answered that appetite with commemorative designs, whose exact production history remains less simple than their confident inscriptions suggest. By early 1741, the expedition moved through Caribbean waters, carrying overwhelming force and dangerously little margin for delay. When Cartagena finally rose beyond the haze, British strength was visible in masts extending across the Caribbean horizon for miles. Contemporary accounts and later historians disagree on totals, but the expedition plainly dwarfed the force Vernon had taken to Portobello. Its warships carried heavy guns, while transports held thousands of soldiers whose usefulness depended upon reaching defensible ground quickly. Every anchored day consumed provisions, fouled water, burdened boat crews, and exposed packed decks to an unforgiving tropical disease environment. The city did not stand directly before them. Lagoons, islands, shoals, and fortified channels separated open sea from Cartagena's harbor. Boca Grande, the nearer northern passage, was obstructed and unsuitable for the fleet, making Boca Chica the practical route into the harbor. Boca Chica narrowed the campaign into a stone gateway, where ships could not simply spread out and safely exploit superior numbers. Fort San Luis guarded Tierra Bamba on one side, while San Jose and smaller works covered the opposing shore. Their guns covered the channel, and a boom with Spanish vessels behind it complicated any direct passage toward Cartagena. To reach the inner bay, Vernon first had to silence those positions or force ships through concentrated defensive fire. Landing elsewhere could not erase the problem. Artillery, supplies, and supporting vessels still needed a secure entrance behind them. Lezo lacked ships and men for an equal contest at sea, so the narrows converted British abundance into congestion. Spanish commanders could predict the immediate objective because geography had already selected Boca Chica for the British planners before fighting began. The outer defenses were therefore expected to delay, damage, and reveal British methods, not necessarily survive indefinitely under sustained attack. British troops landed on Tierra Bamba, establishing themselves where they could approach San Luis and bring siege artillery forward. That movement required boats, protected beaches, ammunition, labor, and naval cover before the first serious battery could operate ashore. Spanish troops and local defenders contested the approaches, then yielded positions when holding them, threatened forces needed farther inside. Each withdrawal might resemble collapse from offshore, but it preserved defenders while forcing British engineers to begin another task. After repeated bombardment, breaches and disabled guns created openings, yet soldiers still had to occupy the exposed ground ashore. Damaged walls could ease in advance, but soldiers still had to move guns, secure ground, and protect exposed working parties. Each service judged progress through its own burdens. Sailors saw exposed ships, while soldiers saw fortifications still standing ahead. Disagreements over support and timing sharpened because every request moved risk from one command onto the other during the siege. Cartagena's defenders benefited from that friction without causing it. British delays alone extended exposure to heat, fatigue, and infection. Sickness was already removing men from duty, although surviving records do not support one perfectly precise daily count for the expedition. Contemporaries used broad labels for fevers and fluxes, making modern certainty about every diagnosis impossible despite the evident devastation. The operational effect was clearer than the medical vocabulary. Crews weakened, labor slowed, and effective strength fell without battle. Even so, the siege advanced. British batteries closed upon San Luis, and sustained pressure steadily made its defense harder. Lezo's ships added their guns from behind the defenses, using protected water as another layer of resistance inside the channel. British strength mattered most once its parts aligned. Heavy guns ashore and warships nearby pressed the same fortified system. Stone absorbed punishment, but could not make San Luis permanent. Damage, dwindling options, and pressure narrowed the defenders' choices. When British troops finally moved against San Luis, its defenders could no longer treat the outer position as worth unlimited losses. Spanish forces withdrew from the battered works, preserving part of the garrison for defenses closer to the city itself. British soldiers entered San Luis, and Bocachica's principal obstacle had fallen after a demanding combined operation rather than one blow. This was a genuine British success. It opened the prospect of entering the bay exactly as the plan required. With San Luis lost, the remaining entrance works became difficult to hold, and Spain's outer defensive line began giving way. Lezo responded by sacrificing vessels and obstructing the channel, turning naval assets that could not win into barriers that might delay. Wrecks and obstacles did not permanently seal the passage, but clearing them consumed effort while sickness continued its quieter work. From British decks, the sequence looked persuasive. Forts had fallen, Spanish ships were sacrificed, and the harbor seemed open. From the Spanish side, Bocachica had performed its essential function, because the gateway was lost only after precious time was consumed. British ships could now enter Cartagena's enclosed waters, carrying damaged hulls, weakened men, and command disputes through the conquered gateway. Passing Bocachica placed British ships inside waters Spain had defended for weeks, and outwardly confirmed the expedition's momentum again. The harbor was not the city, and control of its entrance did not secure Cartagena's walls or approaches. Spanish defenders withdrew toward stronger positions, leaving damaged forts, obstructed channels, and abandoned ground between Britain and its objective. Vernon could now move larger vessels inward, but wrecks and shoals still governed where those vessels could safely pass. Clearing a route demanded soundings, boats, cables, and labor from crews already diminished by sickness and prolonged exertion in hostile waters. Spanish commanders could not prevent entry forever, so they traded ships and positions for additional days before Cartagena itself. Lezo's remaining vessels were eventually sunk or abandoned, denying Britain prizes while adding obstacles within the harbor's confined passages. Sacrifice had replaced maneuver, because preserving those ships offered less value than slowing the fleet that had overwhelmed them. To British observers, each wreck looked like evidence that Spanish resistance was collapsing rather than changing shape before them. That interpretation was reasonable. The outer forts were gone, Spanish naval resistance was broken, and British vessels occupied the bay. Possession of the water created options, but every useful option still required soldiers to land and artillery to follow. Cartagena remained protected by its walls, while Fort San Felipe dominated the landward route from elevated ground outside them. Marshes, narrow roads, and broken terrain constrained movement, preventing Britain from deploying its full strength as cleanly as offshore. The defenders had fewer men, yet fortifications allowed small bodies to hold crucial points, while reserves remained closer to Cartagena. Eslava and Lezo disagreed at times, but both understood that survival now depended upon denying Britain a rapid conclusion. British troops landed near the city and occupied advanced positions, bringing the campaign closer to San Felipe's steep approaches. The movement appeared to complete Bocachica's promise. Once ashore in strength, Wentworth could attack Cartagena from the landward side. Reality was less orderly, because landing men was easier than maintaining them with food, ammunition, tools, and reliable communications. Boats connected army and fleet across crowded water, making routine supply dependent upon weather, distance, schedules, and daily cooperation. Wentworth needed naval guns close enough to support operations, while Vernon feared exposing major ships within restricted waters unnecessarily. Each commander could identify genuine dangers in the other's proposal, which made mutual suspicion easier to sustain under pressure. Orders crossed the harbor, answers returned slowly, and practical disagreements acquired personal weight as the expedition's condition deteriorated further. Illness no longer threatened only future operations. It was already deciding how many men could march, dig, haul, or stand guard. Hospitals and ships received growing numbers of sick men, placing additional demands upon attendants, boats, space, water, and provisions. Many troops remained alive yet unavailable, a distinction that mattered enormously when commanders calculated assault columns in working parties. British numerical superiority therefore shrank operationally before casualty totals alone could reveal how severely the expedition had weakened ashore. Delay now worked twice for Spain. It strengthened the defender's position and reduced the force available to attack it. Still, withdrawal was not inevitable, because Britain had captured the entrance and retained formidable ships, guns, and troops nearby. The question had changed from whether the fleet could penetrate Cartagena's defenses to whether its army could finish quickly. San Felipe made speed difficult by forcing attackers uphill toward prepared walls across ground that offered limited room for formation. Its strength came not from height alone, but from approaches that exposed movement and narrowed the value of superior numbers. Before attacking, Wentworth needed dependable intelligence about walls, ditches, access points, and the ladders required to cross them successfully. Reconnaissance was difficult around an active fortress, and information gathered under pressure could be incomplete, contradictory, or outdated quickly. Spanish troops outside the main works could harass preparations, then withdraw without accepting the open battle Britain preferred ashore. Their purpose was not theatrical defiance. Every disrupted road, delayed gun, or uncertain report consumed British health and time. Vernon pressed for action, seeing continued delay as a danger that would make the expedition progressively less capable daily. Wentworth faced the opposite immediate risk. Attacking without adequate preparation could spend the remaining healthy infantry in one attempt. Neither danger was imaginary, and their collision produced no safe choice, only competing ways for the campaign to fail. British forces advanced their positions around San Felipe, while engineers, officers, and guides tried to turn uncertain ground into a plan. Behind them, the captured harbor held an armada whose greatest victories had purchased access, but not a workable ending. Around San Felipe, British officers confronted a fortress whose slopes and ditches converted every missing detail into operational danger. Maps could indicate walls, but not guarantee where ladders would reach or whether assault columns could approach together safely. Engineers needed time to examine the works, while infantry needed shelter, supplies, and enough health to remain effective daily. Time now favored Spain so strongly that careful preparation and dangerous delay had become almost indistinguishable to British commanders. Vernon judged the army too hesitant after naval effort had forced Bocachica and opened the harbor at heavy cost. Wentworth judged naval support insufficient for the land operation expected to deliver the conquest promised by those successes offshore. Their surviving correspondence reveals arguments over responsibility, timing, and assistance, not a single simple quarrel explaining the defeat alone. Each service also faced its own constraints, because ships could not climb hills and infantry could not command harbors. Cooperation had enabled Bocachica, but success there did not eliminate the institutional boundary between fleet and army commands ashore. As relations worsened, requests became evidence of obstruction, and every postponement seemed to confirm the other commander's failings under pressure. Spanish leadership was not perfectly harmonious either, and later accounts sometimes magnified Lezo's individual role beyond the evidence permits. Eslava held overall command, while Lezo contributed naval experience, defense planning, and practical knowledge accumulated through earlier campaigns at sea. Their disagreements did not prevent the defense from exploiting terrain, fortifications, and Britain's rapidly declining effective strength around Cartagena. Spanish withdrawals had concentrated remaining defenders near the decisive ground, shortening their communications, while Britain's supply line lengthened inland. Every British ration, cartridge, tool, and heavy object now traveled from ship to shore, then toward exposed positions inland. Movement over rough approaches demanded animals, laborers, and healthy soldiers, precisely the resources disease and fatigue were consuming fastest. Siege guns might reduce walls methodically, but placing them required roads, platforms, protection, ammunition, and days Britain scarcely possessed. An immediate storming attempt avoided that timetable only by transferring the problem from artillery to vulnerable infantry columns alone. That trade-off defined the approaching decision. Speed could preserve manpower from sickness or destroy it against prepared stone defenses. Vernon's pressure therefore reflected real urgency, even if his confidence understated what hurried soldiers would face beneath San Felipe. Reconnaissance produced enough information to identify approaches, but not enough certainty to remove crucial doubts about obstacles along them. Guides and deserters could offer details, yet their knowledge varied, and commanders had little opportunity to verify every claim. One uncertainty concerned the ditch and whether scaling ladders would be long enough wherever assault parties reached walls first. Another concerned routes through darkness, because separated columns needed to arrive together rather than warn defenders in sequence prematurely. Night promised concealment from Spanish fire, but also magnified confusion, broken formations, mistaken directions, and delayed orders on approach. Surprise could compensate for weakness only if troops crossed difficult ground before defenders recognized and reinforced the threatened point. If the approach stalled beneath San Felipe, concealment would vanish, leaving crowded infantry exposed without the heavy bombardment expected. The British still possessed courage, discipline, and substantial force, but those qualities could not correct ladders, terrain, or timing. North American troops and other units had already endured conditions that blurred distinctions between combat strength and nominal strength. Officers selecting assault parties therefore worked from returns that might list men whose health could fail during exertion itself. Behind the lines, sickness filled improvised treatment spaces and weakened crews responsible for carrying reinforcements or evacuating casualties from shore. No commander could know exactly how quickly the expedition would deteriorate, but nobody could mistake its direction by then. Retreat at this stage meant abandoning gains purchased at Boca Chica and admitting the Armada could enter, yet not conquer. A formal siege offered greater preparation, but allowed fever, supply problems, and Spanish improvements to continue working together daily. The remaining option was a rapid assault, seeking to turn temporary access into victory before British strength ebbed further. Wentworth accepted the attempt, not because San Felipe appeared weak, but because alternatives were narrowing faster than defenses ahead. The plan called for troops to move before daylight, approach from separate directions, and scale the fortress quickly together. Grenadiers and supporting units would carry the burden, while reserves waited to exploit any entry or contained failure nearby. Ladders, tools, ammunition, and guides now mattered as much as bravery, because one missing element could halt entire columns. Before dawn, the assault force began assembling below San Felipe, while Spanish guards surveyed the darkened approaches from stone ramparts. Before daylight, British columns started uphill, carrying ladders, tools, and ammunition through ground. Their guides understood imperfectly under immense pressure. Darkness concealed movement from distant observers, but it also separated units and hid obstacles until men reached them at close range. Spanish sentries detected the approach before surprise could settle the contest, leaving defenders time to occupy threatened ramparts and alert nearby reserves. Signals and movement within San Felipe transformed the dark fortress into an organized position rather than a sleeping target. British columns pressed forward, but steep, uneven approaches disrupted alignment and prevented their strength from arriving at one point. Smoke and fire from the walls forced attackers toward limited cover, while officers struggled to restore broken formations below. The assault had depended upon speed, coordination, and immediate access to the parapet, and all three conditions were failing together. Some troops reached the ditch, only to discover that crossing and scaling were harder than their planning had allowed under darkness. Accounts repeatedly describe ladders proving too short at crucial points, though details differ across contemporary and later narratives of the assault. Whatever the exact distribution of faulty equipment, attackers below the walls could not convert arrival into entry at decisive locations. Men carrying ladders crowded narrow approaches, while units behind them lost momentum and exposed positions became increasingly untenable before sunrise. Scaling parties could not simply shift elsewhere because darkness, terrain, and fortress geometry restricted movement between approaches during the mounting confusion. Spanish defenders needed only to deny access long enough for surprise to disappear and British cohesion to unravel beneath the ramparts. Lezo and Eslava had preserved forces for precisely this moment, when concentrated resistance could outweigh British numbers on constrained ground. Their defense did not require annihilating the assault force. It required preventing a foothold before daylight exposed the attempt. British reserves waited for a breach or opened gate, but neither appeared, and commitment without access promised only greater losses. Officers tried to redirect troops and renew pressure, yet local efforts could not repair the plan's broken synchronization before dawn. Another push required fresh men, usable ladders, and an approach the defenders had not already reinforced beneath the fortress walls. No such combination existed. San Felipe remained closed, and the British force below it was losing coherence with every passing minute. Wentworth eventually ordered withdrawal because remaining beneath the walls could no longer produce success proportionate to the danger facing his troops. Retreating columns moved downhill, carrying exhausted men and abandoned equipment, while the fortress still commanded the morning approaches above them. Broken ladders and scattered tools remained near the ditch, physical evidence that courage had reached stone without crossing it. The attack had failed tactically because preparation, coordination, equipment, terrain, and resistance combined at the decisive point against the columns. Reducing the result to ladders alone would be misleading, since those ladders mattered inside a broader collapsing operation already short of time. Better ladders could have removed one obstacle, but not disease, uncertain reconnaissance, divided command, or strengthened Spanish defenses around the fortress. Likewise, blaming sickness alone ignores the defenders who shaped British choices and held the place sickness made urgent to capture quickly. San Felipe worked because its walls concentrated Spanish power, while its approaches dispersed British power before contact with the ramparts. That asymmetry explains how a smaller defense survived an expedition whose totals looked overwhelming when counted aboard ships offshore. Nominal strength remained scattered among vessels, hospitals, supply duties, captured positions, and units too weakened for assault that morning. Spain's defenders meanwhile operated near shorter routes, familiar ground, and a fortress prepared for exactly such pressure from below. News of failure moved back toward the harbor, where Vernon received another reason to condemn the Army's conduct ashore. Wentworth could answer that naval pressure had demanded haste without providing the conditions needed for a sound siege operation ashore. Both arguments contained truth, and both protected institutional reputations, while the expedition's remaining options narrowed sharply after San Felipe. A renewed assault required healthier troops, improved intelligence, proper equipment, and cooperation that recent failure had further damaged between commanders. A formal bombardment still required artillery, roads, platforms, and time, all increasingly scarce around the British encampments outside Cartagena's walls. Holding captured ground without progress offered Spain exactly what it wanted: more days for disease to weaken Britain further. The morning after the assault therefore changed more than possession of one fort. It altered what remained realistically possible. San Felipe still stood, the city remained connected to its defenders, and Britain's healthiest attacking force had been repulsed. Across the approaches, abandoned ladders marked the limit of an operation designed around superiority but defeated by sequence and delay. The next decision would no longer concern how to capture Cartagena quickly, but whether capture remained achievable at all. After San Felipe, commanders reviewed an expedition that still looked immense at anchor, but had become dangerously hollow ashore. Morning returns listed losses from the assault, while hospital reports revealed a larger force disappearing from effective service daily. Disease had become the expedition's decisive arithmetic, reducing crews, infantry, transport capacity, and the labor supporting every possible plan. Men who could not march still needed water, shelter, attendants, and boats, burdening comrades who remained fit for duty. Replacing them locally was impossible, and reinforcements from across the Atlantic could not arrive within the campaign's shrinking timetable. Wentworth could reorganize surviving battalions, but no reorganization restored the experienced men already dead, sick, or physically exhausted ashore. Vernon still commanded formidable warships, though weakened crews reduced their ability to move, bombard, land parties, and sustain operations. The fleet's guns could punish exposed walls, but Cartagena's decisive defenses were not conveniently presented beside deep navigable water. Ships could not solve the hill, and weakened infantry could not exploit naval fire without another costly approach inland. Spanish commanders recognized the changed balance and avoided offering the open battle British strength might still have won decisively. Holding San Felipe preserved the city, while patience allowed heat, infection, and British quarrels to continue their work outside. Cartagena's defenders also suffered sickness, shortages, and losses, so their survival should not be mistaken for effortless endurance there. Their advantage was relative because British deterioration was faster, and the attacker needed positive progress to justify remaining ashore. Every day without capture therefore counted as Spanish success, even when no fort changed hands and no engagement occurred. British working parties could strengthen camps or move supplies, but those tasks merely maintained an operation no longer advancing. Empty places in formations multiplied, while abandoned tents and overloaded boats made the expedition's decline physically visible around camp. Wentworth considered what another attack required, then measured those needs against troops actually available for a renewed effort ashore. The gap between nominal strength and usable strength had become too large for confident calculations based on fleet totals. Vernon's dispatches defended naval performance and pressed responsibility toward the Army, while Wentworth's explanations emphasized missing support and impossible conditions. Their argument mattered beyond pride, because each commander was already constructing the record by which Britain would judge failure. Yet paperwork could not postpone the operational decision because provisions, manpower, and shipboard health continued worsening in harbor daily. Remaining promised no clear route to victory, while withdrawal risked damaged ships, vulnerable embarkations, and Spanish pressure from shore. An orderly departure required concealing weakness, recovering troops and stores, then moving vessels back through constrained harbor passages safely. Before leaving, the British destroyed or disabled positions they could not hold, denying defenders immediate use of captured works. Guns and equipment that could be removed demanded scarce labor, while anything abandoned measured the cost of retreat visibly. Embarkation reversed the earlier landing sequence, carrying diminished units from exposed ground toward crowded ships and uncertain recovery offshore. Spanish defenders did not need a reckless pursuit because the departing expedition was already surrendering its objective and positions. Their restraint preserved forces and avoided giving British guns the concentrated targets that open pursuit might have presented offshore. Ship after ship received sick soldiers, exhausted survivors, salvaged stores, and the administrative burden of accounting for absent men. Decks that had carried invasion now functioned as transport, hospital, refuge, and evidence that Cartagena had outlasted them all. The retreat through Boca Chica past Forts Britain had battered into submission, gains rendered strategically useless by failure inland afterward. San Luis had fallen exactly as planned, yet its capture had consumed the time that made later success harder. This was the campaign's cruel logic, since each British achievement opened another obstacle, while disease steadily reduced capacity to overcome it. Spanish losses had purchased delay, and delay transformed Britain's numerical advantage from a battlefield fact into a misleading inventory. Once outside the harbor, the fleet remained powerful enough to threaten other targets, but Cartagena was no longer attainable. The battered expedition withdrew toward Jamaica, where commanders could regroup survivors, assess ships, and exchange accusations in writing ashore. News traveling to Britain would arrive through dispatches, private letters, merchant reports, and rumors moving at unequal speeds homeward. Public expectation had been prepared for conquest by Vernon's reputation and early reports of British progress around Cartagena itself. The fall of Boca Chica could easily sound like the city's fall when compressed across an ocean hungry for victory. In London, engraved copper had already supplied the ending reality refused to provide, leaving defeat to catch up with celebration. When reliable reports reached Britain, the expedition's earlier progress no longer supported celebration. Cartagena remained Spanish, and the surviving armada carried defeat. Vernon and Wentworth defended their services in competing accounts, ensuring that responsibility became another contested legacy of the campaign. Around Cartagena, abandoned British works and shattered outer defenses marked an immense effort that had failed at its final objective. Losses were enormous, although exact totals vary because records separate combat deaths, disease, missing men, and later fatalities inconsistently. Spanish defenders also endured severe losses and disease, making survival a costly achievement rather than an effortless miracle there. Blas de Lezo died only months afterward following illness, although sources do not justify turning his death into a simple battlefield consequence. Cartagena remained in Spanish hands, preserving a major Caribbean port and denying Britain the strategic prize its expedition had sought. Britain still possessed substantial naval power, but surviving ships could not convert Bocachica's capture into control of the city. The expedition failed through accumulation, not one mistake. Geography imposed sequence, Spanish resistance imposed delay, and disease punished every delay. Divided command then made adaptations slower, because naval and army leaders assessed different dangers while their shared margin disappeared. San Felipe became decisive because Britain reached it, weakened, hurried, poorly informed, and unable to prepare the assault its defenses required. The latters mattered, but they marked a larger failure to align intelligence, equipment, timing, support, and healthy manpower together. Spanish commanders did not need to destroy the Armada. They only needed its usable strength to expire before Cartagena's defenses did. The surviving Greenwich medal compresses that complicated campaign into a scene only 36 millimeters wide, with no room for uncertainty. On its face, Vernon receives a sword from the kneeling figure, labeled Don Blas, beneath a declaration of humbled Spanish pride. Across the reverse, ships approach forts and a chained channel while the inscription announces that British heroes took Cartagena. April 1741 appears below, giving false certainty to the month when the actual expedition was being driven toward withdrawal. The museum dates this example after 1741, so it cannot alone prove that craftsmen struck it before the outcome. Nor was it an official campaign report. Its unknown maker offered patriotic certainty in a commercial commemorative object instead. The medal, nevertheless, records a real appetite for triumph, shaped by Portobello and sustained by reports that confused progress with conquest. Cartagena never surrendered. Subscribe for more military history and decide which mattered most at Cartagena: Spanish defense, British command failure, or disease.